I do love his preaching. He's an amazing preacher, of course. But over time, there are a couple things I noticed. One is that I do wonder, with his strong emphasis on the gospel-centered preaching and like, hey, Jesus is the true and better of all the figures that you see in the scriptures, and the real desire to avoid moralism in your preaching. I just wrote down, I wonder, this is one of the thoughts I had, is when you think about, in the attempt to avoid moralizing, does he fall into a trap where he might actually be missing one of the key elements of what in the medieval interpretive practice called the quadriga, the fourfold sense of Scripture? Like, is there a way that he could round out the sermons a little bit better to not just talk about, and so here's the way I phrase it, meaning, did he foreground the typological sense of Scripture at the expense of the tropological? That there is still a moral push that needs to be rounded out after you go through the typology. And this is relevant also in the standard form of his sermon, which I began to, the form underneath the way he did the sermons over time, is he would kind of present, as he's walked through a text, and say, hey, here's what the text says you are supposed to do, here's how you can't, and here's how Christ did. Awesome, great. And I just, over time, I started to sense like, and I want this final piece, and maybe sometimes he does it, but it's not the common way, is now how, in light of that, can we live differently? And how is the community that's shaped by the gospel formed by this in a profoundly different way? I just wanted to hear that over time, where I started to notice that. And also, the two ditches trope that he would often use is either religion or irreligion. I think that sometimes was imposed on texts and became a distraction to me to a degree. And then I had questions about, I'll maybe lastly, I do think, so I know we're going to talk about the moment that we're in, and we're going to talk about politics. The name Donald Trump will come up. He comes up every single day at some point in your life. Every single day. It's going to happen. And I don't critique him for not supporting Trump. I think what people do critique is there does seem to be a subtext of like dumping on people who do support Trump. And this, I just even looked back over the decline and renewal piece, and I control F'd Trump, MAGA, etc. And they're just, the subtext there is these people are fundamentalists. And there's just kind of broadsides against them. And I think in a way that's a little bit uncharitable. And also I think he made anticipations there and elsewhere that broad support for Trump would actually harm evangelistic opportunities. And I'm just not sure that that is the case. I'm not sure it's necessarily the opposite either. We'll have to wait and see. But I think, again, that's part of the interpreting politics through the lens of evangelism problem that I have. First of all, I think that's the wrong way to just think about politics. But secondly, I'm not convinced that we can be so certain about those things. And I do think there are broadsides against fundamentalists that are often pop up against the religious right, against Trump supporters, that I just wish he would have been more charitable in. And I do think, lastly, there's a method that you do see from time to time. This comes out, if you could look this up, it's a fascinating little story. Kirsten Powers' story about her leaving Trump's church, or no, the opposite, Keller's church. And she says, I was attracted to Keller's brand of evangelicalism. That's the term she uses. And then she talks about like what that brand is. And she was like, intellectual, sophisticated. But she said, when I signed up for Keller's brand of evangelism, she said, I was signing up for that whole thing I just mentioned. But she said, I also appreciate that from the pulpit, he never talked about homosexuality or abortion, et cetera, as a sin. And then I only had to find years down the road that that's what their church thought about these things. And I wonder about that. I'm not saying that that's her account is absolutely true. But if it is, I do have questions about that methodology. And not only do I think there's dangers there that you might hide away from offensive truths that are clear in Scripture, I think you will also, there's a danger of really making people feel tricked once they're brought in. There's that, and I just do wonder if there's a place, yes, we need to avoid, what was the term Collin used? The term you used about polemics, that polemics is medicine and not food. And I've heard that trope elsewhere. But is there another category of just forthright speech that isn't necessarily polemics? That also might be missiologically strategic, but also just faithful. And so those are some of the challenges I push. And he does from time to time do that. But if the Kirsten Powers story is also true, I think there are gaps there that we should consider. There are pitfalls there that are worth considering. So there you go. Those are my opening comments.
Paul have a chance to respond to that, and then James a chance to respond.
Right? Okay. One of the first books that I ever worked on in my career was called The Leadership Secrets of Billy Graham. It was a great introduction for me to the entire evangelical world that I didn't grow up in, converted into, but didn't grow up in. One of the things that I appreciated most about Billy Graham is I actually had responsibility for 2 chapters. It turns out the Lord knew what was in my future. So the chapters were on Billy Graham's failures and his critics. Those are my 2 responsibilities. And Billy Graham is probably the most famous Christian in American history, one of the great evangelists of all time. And I don't think another religious figure in American history was more criticized. Widespread criticism of him. And having made some mistakes, some of which he acknowledged, some of which he did not. Some of which he kind of knew were mistakes. Like, for example, he physically threw up when he found out about what Richard Nixon had said and done, things like that, because they'd been so close. And then others, like things that he said about religious freedom in Russia, and then the Soviet Union, things like that. But the point was, one of the things I appreciated most about him is his attitude toward his critics, and at the same time also his willingness to go back and to recognize areas that where he'd made mistakes. And one of the things that you saw remarked upon at his death, which wasn't that long ago, laying state in the Capitol when President Trump was in office the first time, they've so much remarked on his personal humility. And one of the things that enabled me to be able to write the book that I did was Tim's willingness to talk about how he did not have everything figured out, he didn't have all the answers, certainly for the future, had made mistakes. And what also stood out is that I don't know if people understand how uncommon that is. That is not common, especially for somebody who is at the pinnacle of their career achievements. I was just thinking about the question of what are we talking about when we're talking about Tim Keller's legacy? And this will be for future generations, certainly not for me to be able to adjudicate as somebody who worked closely with him. But when you considered, James talked about a number of the different aspects and highlighting a lot of wonderful specifics of things that he appreciated. But we can expand this to his Christ-centered preaching in the Voss tradition, reviving and perpetuating that. I think the number one thing that he was known for or will be known for is a movement of church planting in global cities, to the point where you can virtually not go to a major city around the world and miss a church that he had helped to start through Redeemer City to City. He also was instrumental in building a global church network with one of the largest Christian websites in the world, which is, of course, the Gospel Coalition there. Instrumental in expanding the PCA beyond the Southeast. He was not the only person who did that, but he was the most influential person who did that. I don't think many of his critics give him credit for being one of the key figures in opposing the rise of egalitarianism, but he was, as a disciple of Elizabeth Elliot, his professor at Gordon Conwell. I went back in my book and I had done a study of the writings of some of his egalitarian professors that he very publicly and boldly rebuked. And those arguments were worse than almost anything. Things like, well, Paul was wrong about slavery, so he's wrong about women. Those are the kinds of arguments he was being taught in the rise of evangelical feminism in the 1970s. We could, of course, talk about writing the most effective apologetic works of his generation, maybe at least since C.S. Lewis, and just easily take for granted building churches in Manhattan from almost their entire disappearance in the 20th century. A lot of people don't realize that when you look through evangelical history, New York City was the capital of evangelicalism in the 1800s. And by the 1900s, even by the 1920s, Protestantism had almost disappeared apart from a few beleaguered outposts in Manhattan, and that is absolutely not the case today. So the point is, when you consider somebody who's had that kind of influence, that kind of legacy that we've hardly even scratched the surface of, you don't expect that to be the kind of person who welcomes criticism, handles it with any measure of humility, is willing to learn from mistakes, to grow, to change, to borrow from James, to evolve even in some of his perspectives, and to become more expansive over time. Usually, what happens is the Christian leader, when they become more influential, they become more insular, they shrink, in part because of what James talked about, the celebrity culture, which brings a lot of criticism that makes a lot of people say, I'm only going to surround myself with sycophants. And then when it comes time for them to work on books, they instruct their biographers, you can't say anything negative about me. And then we publish those books, and they're widely celebrated and widely read. They become hagiographies. None of that was the case with Tim. And I think it's one reason that, like Billy Graham, what was ultimately celebrated as his legacy at the end of his life was his individual character. And the people who were speaking and testifying to it were people like his children, like his boys, like his wife, like his best friend that he led to the Lord back in Hopewell, Virginia, wandering in for some marriage counseling after he had been divorced. I just think, isn't it? I mean, when you have a funeral in such a prominent New York City church, you think, well, that might be, it's kind of a showy thing, but then you realize there's no other place that can fit them except for one of the baseball stadiums or Madison Square Garden. That's why they host it there. But how many other major figures at the end of their life would have brought in a parade of just other major religious figures to testify to their greatness? And that's not at all the case of what happened there. So I think part of what makes it easy for us to even discuss Keller's legacy is the fact that he was himself so open to learning, changing, not his core beliefs, but growing, evolving, and taking his critics seriously, as he often commented. I mean, if your critics really knew what was in your heart, it'd be so much worse, and that's what grace is all about. We can get into some more specifics on here if they're helpful here, but one just to mention related to the parenting or to the children one. It's a good observation. I think there's 2 points in particular that are relevant there. One is primarily the New York City, Manhattan context, of course. Singleness, I mean, this is in my book, but the only time that Tim ever did a wedding during a service was when he preached what I think was his most famous message ever, The Girl Nobody Wanted, which is an interesting wedding homily text to take up of Rachel and Leah. But his concern was, how do you do a wedding service that acknowledges that the vast majority here are single, incorporates them? It's related to also the fact that Tim and Kathy were often asked, why didn't you write a book on parenting? Your book on marriage is so great. Another one of those legacies. It's probably still the best one that you can find. And at the same time, why don't you write a book on parenting? The response was, we don't think we were very good parents. And we also find that our friends that we went to seminary with, they were very close with their seminary friends throughout their lives. Some of our seminary friends were amazing parents, and their children did not turn out well. We were not great parents, and our children did turn out well. They said you do not want to give the impression that parenting is an input-output basis. There's a mystery that's involved. There are still principles. I still would have liked to know those principles from them, but even as their friends acknowledged, no, they weren't the best parents. Again, not in a sinful way, but just some people are more predisposed to it than others. So just one kind of minor way of building on what James was talking about.